Good afternoon. Welcome to the March edition of our Supply Chain Management webinar series. A few housekeeping things before we get started. If you have a question during the webinar, raise your hand. If I have the opportunity to, I will answer your question during the webinar. For any questions that I don't get answered, I'll hang around after the webinar as long as people are there asking questions. If you don't get a chance to see this entire webinar, you can go to our webinar page and we have an archive of all of our past webinars for your use as you see fit. Okay, so let's get started today. Today we're going to talk about planning factors and how they impact the MRP calculation. What we're going to look at is the basic MRP calculation to kind of set the stage. Then we're going to look at types of planning factors. And then finally, we're going to wrap up by looking at how those planning factors modify the basic MRP calculation. So here we go. MRP calculation is basically looking at your gross requirements, inventory that you have on hand, and any receipts, whether they're scheduled receipts or planned order receipts, doesn't matter, that you have that can supply the demand. So briefly, the calculation is you start with your available inventory. That's the projected available line. It shows 150 pieces in stock. You would take that 150 pieces, add any scheduled receipts or planned order receipts, subtract the 50 pieces that you have as gross requirement for period 1, and you will come up with a projected available at the end of period number 1 of 100 pieces. That same calculation is done throughout the remainder of the scheduling periods here. Period 2, our projected available balance at the end of the first period is 100. We don't have any receipts scheduled, minus the gross requirements of 50. Would leave us a projected available balance at the end of period 2 of 50 pieces. At the end of period 3, it would project it, our inventory would be 0. And the projected available balance of 0 in the third period, no scheduled receipts or planned order receipts in period 4, would create a net requirement, period number 4, of 50 pieces. MRP would plan a replenishment order for 50 pieces, and that would get our projected available balance at the end of period number 4 at 0 also. Now, one thing I want to point out here, unless we tell MRP differently, MRP will always try to get the projected available balance to 0. So the rest of the planning periods, 5, 6, 7, and 8, we would have orders being placed each period to support the requirements for that period, the net requirements for that period, and our inventory balance at the end of each period would be 0. So that's the basic MRP calculation. That's the logic MRP uses until we tell it to do something different. The things that we use to tell MRP to do it slightly different are called planning factors. And there are 3 types of planning factors that we're going to look at today. Excuse me. First type, planning factors that affect when we place the replenishment order. When do we start on the purchase order? When do we start on the manufacturing order? That's one type of planning factor. The second type of planning factor, when we have to do a resupply order, how much should we procure or manufacture? So this affects the quantity that we're going to be manufacturing or buying. The third type of planning factor is telling MRP of all of our inventory what it can look at. In other words, some locations we may not want MRP to consider what is in that location when it does its MRP calculation. So now I'm going to put you to work a little bit. This is interactive. I'm going to launch a poll here. What I would like you to do is take a minute or two and answer this question. Of the 5 planning factors listed, which planning factors modify when an order is placed? You can pick one or more. So take a minute, make your selection. Which planning factors listed modify when an order is placed? Okay, people are starting to vote. I'm going to keep this going for another about 30 seconds or so. Okay, 5 more seconds, make your choice, and then I'm going to close the poll. All right, closing the poll. So let's see what people had to say. 43% tied at safety stock and fixed order quantity, 29% lot for lot and lead time, and 14% at non-nettable stocking location. Here's the reality. Lead time affects when an order is placed, and safety stock affects when an order is placed. The MRP calculation is the same. However, with safety stock, it kicks it off earlier. With lead time, it says, okay, if I've got a couple week lead time for replenishment and I need it in week number 4, I need to start the replenishment order in week number 2. So the other 3 are talking about the quantity that we order or what inventory we can use for the MRP calculation. All right, so let's go back. Now that we see the 3 types of planning factors, the planning factors that affect when an order is placed, the planning factors that affect how much we are buying or building, and the planning factors that affect what inventory we can actually use for the MRP calculation. So now let's take a look at those planning factors. All right, let's start with the most common planning factor, lead time. What is the replenishment lead time? And we're using the same data that I used for the MRP calculation at the beginning of the webinar here. So with a lead time of 2 weeks, MRP, if I need a planned order receipt in period number 4 of 50 pieces and I have a lead time of 2 weeks, it will say, okay, back off to week number 3, week number 2. At the beginning of week number 2, I place the replenishment order. It takes 2 weeks for it to come in, whether it's a manufactured or purchased item, and it will arrive in time to support that need for 50 pieces at the beginning of week number 4. So that's the lead time offset. The lead time planning factor then applies to all of those planned order receipts that we calculated in the first portion of the webinar. Lead time. Now let's take a look at what safety stock does to the calculation. Now, we are still using the 2-week lead time that we just saw. In this case here, it affects when MRP calculates the first net requirement. When I went through the basic MRP calculation, it was projected available balance from the prior period, plus any receipts, minus gross requirements. Well, when we add safety stock, we add another component there. It is planned order receipts. It is projected available balance prior period, planned order receipts, gross requirements, and safety stock if we are at or below the safety stock level. So in this case here, in period number 3, we would actually have a net requirement, since it's a 10-piece safety stock, we would actually have a net requirement of 10 pieces in week number 3. That 10 pieces is there not to support the gross requirements, but to replenish the inventory to get us at or above safety stock. What effect that has on when we start the order is we would then have a replenishment order started in week number 1 for 10 pieces, which would get our inventory at the end of week number 3 up to 10 pieces, so we are at or above the safety stock level. In this same context, going forward, all of those remaining planned order receipts and releases that we had, because of the safety stock, would get moved up one period earlier because safety stock triggered the resupply earlier than normal. And that's how safety stock works. It triggers the resupply order earlier than you would have normally had MRP calculated. And this additional time is what protects you from those variations in supply and demand, which safety stock compensates for. All right, finally, now we've looked at lead time of 2 weeks, safety stock of 10 weeks. Now we're going to look at the order quantity. We have been using throughout this webinar a lot for lot ordering technique. If I need 50 in a period, I order 50. If, as in the prior example, I needed 10 in a period, I ordered 10. Remember, MRP always tries to solve for 0 available inventory at the end of the period unless we tell it different. In this example here, we're making an order quantity of 200. Now what that means is if I need 199, I buy 200. If I need 201, I buy 400. It's a multiple. So here's how it affects what we've been doing. So we have a net requirement in period 3 driven by the safety stock. The planned order receipt, since we told MRP we are doing this in multiples of 200, is 200 pieces, same lead time of 2 weeks. So we release a job or a purchase order for 200 pieces at the beginning of week 1. It comes in week 2. What it leaves us with at the end of week 3 is a 200 piece available balance. We continue to consume that until we get to week 7, where safety stock triggers another order ahead of when it normally would have, and we do another order of 200 pieces. So that comparison. The prior examples were using lot for lot, and it generated a substantial number of planned order releases and planned order receipts. However, by changing the lot sizing technique to a fixed order quantity of 200, now we can minimize the number of orders we have to place. We can minimize the number of receipts we have to execute. And if we balance it correctly, we can keep our inventory investment reasonable. So we're balancing the cost of ordering and the cost of carrying inventory to where the combined total is as low as possible. So the last thing we need to talk about is this concept of non-nettable stocking locations. When you start off an MRP system, all the locations are by default nettable. But you may have some inventory locations that have parts that have been rejected. They're not scrapped. They're waiting for a material review board. You don't want to lose track of them financially, but you don't want MRP to consider them as good material and calculate to use them to meet some other demand. So what we do is we take a stockroom location and we click a little button on the ERP system that says, hey, this is a non-nettable location. In other words, MRP, don't even consider what's in this location. For our inventory costing, it shows up as a location. The only time non-nettable is used is when we're doing the MRP calculation. Okay, so that was the planning factors, how they modify the basic MRP calculation. And what we covered in the past 15 minutes or so is the basic MRP calculation, the three different types of planning factors that affect when an order is placed, planning factors that affect how much you place the order for, and finally, planning factors that affect what MRP is able to look at as available inventory. Okay, that's it for this month's planning factors.